President Trump and President Zelensky had an hour-long conversation today. This came roughly about 24 hours after Donald Trump had a meeting with Vladimir Putin in which they talked about a ceasefire when it comes to just critical infrastructure and or energy infrastructure. And even though Russia violated that within maybe even 2 hours after that phone call, today Zelensky talked to his counterpoint because that's what he said yesterday. We don't know what that means for Ukraine, but let's discuss this. And I've made multiple videos talking about everything leading up to this meeting. We talked about the press conference that took place afterwards in the White House, which was done by Caroline Leavitt. And now we're finally getting the full statement from the White House, from Rubio and Waltz. They typed this up, at least according to what Trump was saying in his Truth Social tweet. And it's interesting. Before I read this, I want to talk about the way that Donald Trump presented this, because he actually was pretty darn, and that might be the first time I think that Trump has been very down to earth with a statement when it comes to Ukraine on social media. This wasn't one of those it would never happened if I was president, blah, 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 blah kind of situations. And I just want to read that for you. And then from there, we could talk about the statement. It says, just completed a very good telephone call with President Zelensky of Ukraine. It lasted approximately 1 hour. Much of the discussion was based on the call made yesterday with President Putin in order to align both Russia and Ukraine in terms of their requests and need. We are very much on track, and I will ask Secretary Rubio and Mike Waltz to give an accurate description of the points discussed. It was interesting to see how civil and just this is this. I say this because this is the first time I think we've actually seen Trump write something like that, which I think actually is showcasing that instead he's not calling out Zelensky, he's not calling him a dictator, he's not saying that if I was president, those things like that. I think this is a turning point right now. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I have not read this statement yet because I want to react to it in real time by recording myself and putting this online. Because realistically speaking, I'm very educated on this, and I want to see where Trump stands and what the conversation actually led towards. And as you can tell, I'm doing this unedited, which is why you'll see some mistakes while I'm speaking. You see that? So let's read this whole thing and then break it down. Today, President Donald J. Trump and Ukraine's President Zelensky had a fantastic phone conversation. President Zelensky thanked President Trump for a most productive start for the work of the Ukrainian American teams in Saudi Arabia on March 11th. The meeting of the senior officials from both nations significantly helped in moving towards the ending of war. President Zelensky thanked President Trump for the support of the United States, especially the Javelin missiles that President Trump was first to provide, and his efforts towards peace. The leaders also agreed that Ukraine and America will continue working together to bring about a real end to the war, and that lasting peace under President Trump's leadership can be achieved. So far, that's almost exactly what Zelensky put online earlier on Twitter. Here it says that President Trump fully briefed President Zelensky on his conversation with Russian President Vladimir Putin and the key issues discussed. They reviewed the situation, and Kursk agreed to share information closely between their defense staffs as the battlefield situation evolved. President Zelensky asked for additional air defense systems to protect civilians, particularly Patriot missile systems. President Trump agreed to work with him to find what was available, particularly in Europe. So a few things to bring out here. The Kursk situation, we've heard Donald Trump say that 2,500 Ukrainians are encircled, yet there was no real verified information on that. Russian Telegram and Ukrainian Telegram actually disprove what Trump says. That 2,500 number is something that Putin has said, at least the Kremlin has said, which propaganda right there. I think it was something in which Putin was trying to build something up to say, hey, look, we will let these people go. Look how good we are, when there really was nothing there to begin with. About the Patriot missile system, it's something that Ukraine's been asking for quite some time as Russia is attacking critical infrastructure. And I think this is one of those things that allowed Ukraine to agree to the ceasefire on critical infrastructure, knowing that if Russia does try to take out that stuff, Ukraine will have some extra things to lock it down, which we know that Russia does violate their agreements. Since 2014, Minsk 1, Minsk 2, Russia has violated it 26 times, which eventually led to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It says here the two leaders also agreed on a partial ceasefire against energy. Technical teams will meet in Saudi Arabia in the coming days to discuss broadening the ceasefire to the Black Sea on a way to a full ceasefire, something which, remember, Ukraine already agreed to. Zelensky has pointed that out many of times. It's like we agree to it, but Russia never would. They're trying to drag this out, and that's exactly what happened. He says they agreed on this would be the first step towards the full end of the war, ensuring security. President Zelensky was grateful for the president's leadership in this effort and reiterated his willingness to adapt to a full ceasefire. It's 3 times, by the way, in which we saw Zelensky thank Trump, which in his own statement on X, he's thanked him at least 2 or 3 times. President Trump also discussed Ukraine's electrical supply in nuclear power plants. He said the United States could be very helpful in running those plants with electricity and utility expertise. And American ownership of those plants would be the best protection for that infrastructure and support for Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Now, this is interesting because what they're referring to here with those plants are places like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, in which Russia has the plant in their control because they stole it during the war, but they're surrounded by Ukrainian territory. Now, Russia refuses to give that up, and Russia has separated the power plant from the grid, which could cause an issue. They've actually shelled the power plant, and the power plant at this very moment is in a cool-down phase. So it's actually not generating anything, but it's still at risk. If it takes a direct hit, something could happen. But from this statement, it looks like the United States would like to maybe get it under their control, and then the U.S., I don't know if they would technically own it, but they would run it and potentially make money off of that, which could kick Russia out of Zaporizhzhia. But I think that's something you have to think about. It would be really strange because that is owned by a private company inside of Ukraine. How do you make that happen? Unless it's just a I don't know if it'd be, what kind of transaction would that be? Where maybe it's like, hey, you could run it, maybe kick the Russians out for X amount of time, make some of your money back, and then it's coming back to us. I don't know. This is coming out as I'm reading it with you. It says here that President Zelensky also thanked President Trump for continuing to push humanitarian concerns, including the exchange of POWs. I know that Trump had said that he put together that prisoner swap that took place earlier today. That's not actually true. We do know that that was something already pre-planned. So he noted that they had a successful exchange, thanked the president for his leadership. President Trump also asked President Zelensky about the children who had gone missing from Ukraine during the war, including the ones that had been abducted. President Trump promised to work closely with both parties to help make sure those children were returned home. Remember, there are 20,000 Ukrainian children were kidnapped by the Russians and brought into Russia, in which Russian families then adopted these kids. Some of these kids were adopted as young as, 1 and 2, and it's one of those that's just terrifying because those kids have no idea that they actually are Ukrainian, and they were stolen by Russians. Think about that. And then the ending paragraph. They agreed all parties must continue the efforts to make a ceasefire work. The presidents noted the positive work of their advisors and representatives, especially Secretary Rubio, National Security Advisor Waltz, Special Envoy Kellogg, and others. The presidents instructed their teams to move towards with technical issues related to implementing and broadening the partial ceasefire. The presidents instructed their advisors and representatives to carry out this work as quickly as possible. The presidents emphasized that in further meetings, the teams can agree on all necessary aspects of advancing towards a lasting peace and security. Okay, so what do we think here? This was actually a really good statement. There was no name calling. They didn't actually need to include in there how many times Zelensky thanked the United States and thanked Trump himself. They even brought up the Javelins, which, remember, had nothing to even do with Zelensky, because that was all the way back in Trump's first term. I am seeing, hopefully, Trump understanding where we're at. I think possibly the phone call that he had with Putin made him realize certain things about Putin, which would hopefully bode very well for Ukraine down the line. The only thing that really was interesting to me in this was two things. Actually, three things. One, the United States' willingness to find Patriot missile systems for Ukraine in Europe, which we do know there are some. And I'm sure that Trump will use his power to bring that to Ukraine. Next is the return of Ukrainian children, something in which some Russians claim has never happened, that they kidnapped children. They did. It's been documented. There's a lot of children that luckily were returned. So yeah, there's plenty of evidence that Russia does this, and they still do this. But the biggest thing that I found interesting was the American ownership of some of these either nuclear power plants or other power system plants. I'm not really quite sure how that would work. That's the only thing that makes me go, oh, huh. I mean, is that the only way to get Russia out of that nuclear power plant? I don't think so. But would the Russians be willing to let the United States take over with a clause in place in which Ukraine would get it back down the line? I don't know. This is something that wasn't even a thought. So this was quite interesting. This also wasn't mentioned on the Ukrainian readout, which I found interesting as well. I don't think that, I think this was just a spitball idea. It's like, well, hey, you guys need the nuclear power plant back, right? Well, if Russia won't give it to you, maybe we could potentially own it, and that way Russia will give it up. Remember that that's like one of the largest nuclear power plants in Europe. Actually, I think it is the largest in Europe. And it being down is a significant issue. Getting it back is not only good for Ukraine, but also for Europe. So the question is, if the United States owns it, does that mean Europe then has to pay the United States? See how that kind of works out? I'm kind of trying to figure that out. And would this be a replacement for the minerals rights deal, which we know is now beyond, according to Caroline, that's now beyond that? Really good questions that we don't have answers to. This was a very good conversation, very constructive. I do think that Putin will violate the ceasefire fairly quickly. Ukraine did agree to it, so we'll see what happens. I mean, usually in about a few hours when we start seeing explosions, so we'll see what happens. Now, I want to know what you think. I gave you my unedited kind of video just so that you have a good understanding. But if you haven't done so yet, please follow my videos. Please subscribe. And yesterday, I just uploaded a video talking to a Ukrainian soldier who was trained in Operation Interflex in the UK, United Kingdom. And I would suggest you check it out. It's quite interesting, that entire program. I also had conversations with colonels who are actually in charge of that program, which was really awesome. I didn't do an interview, but I did speak to them. But go ahead and check out that video. It's the one before this one. And I want to thank you once again. If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe, turn on notifications, and give this video a thumbs up. I'm Joey. I'll see you later.